Oh, good morning, kids. I wonder, can you tell me, what is this? Can you see that? What is that? Maybe you've seen one of these things on the fingers of your parents, or your grandparents, or maybe other adults that you know that are married. Of course, it is a wedding ring, isn't it? It's a wedding ring. And men and women give each other wedding rings when they get married. On their special day, they make promises to each other, promises to love each other in the good times and the bad times, to love each other when they're well and when they're sick, to love each other when they've got what they need, and to love when they don't have what they need. And to show as a sign that they're making the promise, they put the wedding rings on each other's fingers, don't they, as a sign of their promise. Now, you know, when Alison and I got married, the man looking after our wedding rings, when he got them out of his pocket, well, he could only find one ring. There was only one ring in his pocket, and he didn't know where the other one was. There was a panic just for a moment, and then he realised that actually Alison's ring had slipped directly, perfectly right inside my ring. It was funny just for a moment. Well, you know, in the Bible, we read about God making many promises to lots of people. I'm sure you know of the rainbow that God put in the sky to tell Noah that he was never going to flood the earth again. And then there's Abraham, isn't there? Before Christmas in Explorers and Junior Church, we thought about all the promises God made to Abraham. He promised that he would give Abraham a son, even in his old age. He promised Abraham that through his son and his family, that they'll become a nation, lots of people, and that nation will live in a new land, and even that through all of them, that the whole world will be blessed. Well, in Explorers, we discovered Abraham had a son that became a nation. What happened next? Well, you know, right now, the adults are reading through the book of Joshua in the Bible. And it's the time when that nation of Israel that God had promised, they go into this new land. Maybe you've heard people talk about the promised land. Well, of course, it's called a promised land because it's a land promised by God. It all started as the people crossed over the River Jordan and they took the city of Jericho. Remember, Ian told us about that the other week when we learned about how to make trumpets. Well, eventually the people of Israel came to live and settle in all of this new land that God had promised. And at the very end of the book, we read that God gave them rest, just as he had promised. But you know, this wasn't a they lived happily ever after kind of story. Because although they lived in the land, they began to disobey God. And they still had enemies that came to attack them. And people still got ill. And they got old. And people died. But do you know that later in the Bible tells us that there is still a promise. There is still a rest, a future rest for God's people. A rest in a land that will have no more enemies. Where nobody will get ill. Where there'll be no more sin. People doing wrong things. And there'll be no more death. This is a promise that God has made, and he's made it to all people who believe in Jesus. You see, as Joshua led the people of Israel into the promised land by fighting the enemies, Jesus leads his people into the forever promised land where he is king because he has fought our enemy, sin and death. Isn't it great that when Jesus died on the cross, he took away the punishment for sin. And when he came back to life in his resurrection, he beat death, no more death. And he makes us friends with God when we believe in him, just as he has promised. And so when we trust in Jesus, we are welcomed, one day welcomed into that wonderful land. God makes lots of promises, big ones and small ones. And so far, God has always kept his promises. And so we can believe in Jesus. We can trust him that he will come back as he's promised. And that we will be with him forever, as he has promised. So, when you read of God's promises in the Bible, we can know and we can trust that they are true. Have a good day.